All right, welcome to the fourth of our presentations in the Future of Freedom Foundation's ongoing conference on restoring civil liberties to America. Our first three speakers were Tom Palmer, Stephen Hallbrook, and James Bovard, and we're privileged to have our speaker tonight. But first, let me just remind you all a little bit about the Future of Freedom Foundation. We were founded in 1989 with the mission of presenting an uncompromising principle case for the libertarian philosophy. And I'd like to think that we've fulfilled that mission over the last 31 years. You can come to our website at fff.org and you'll find nothing but principled arguments on what we need to do to restore a genuinely free society to our land. We have a free daily publication called FFF Daily that we strive and have strived for, 15 years or so to make the finest libertarian commentary page on the internet that's free. We've got a monthly journal called Future of Freedom. We have a weekly show called Libertarian Angle, and we have just countless videos and audio tapes and so forth of presentations that have been made in our conferences and seminars and so forth. So we're really pleased to have a distinguished speaker tonight. Michael Glennon has spoken for the Future of Freedom Foundation in the past. He is a professor of law at international law at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Prior to going into teaching, he was a legal counsel to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He has been the Fulbright Distinguished Professor of International and Constitutional Law in Vytautus Magnus University School of Law in Lithuania, a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, Thomas Hawkins Johnson Visiting Scholar at West Point, Director of Studies at the Hague Academy of International Law, and professeur invité at the University of Paris. He is the author of numerous articles on constitutional and international law, as well as the author of several books. He's a member of the American Law Institute, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Board of Editors of the American Journal of International Law. He has served as consultant to various congressional committees, the U.S. State Department, International Atomic Energy Agency, and has testified before the International Court of Justice and congressional committees. Frequent commentator on public affairs, he has spoken widely within the U.S. and abroad. His op-eds have appeared in the mainstream press like the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, International Herald Tribune, Financial Times, and others. Longtime readers of my daily blog at FFF know that I have long recommended for people to purchase and read Michael Glennon's book, National Security and Double Government. I think it's one of the most insightful books on what is going on in America today. It's a scholarly type book, but yet it's very, very readable, easily readable by the educated layman. And I continue to highly tout that book whenever I have a chance. His forthcoming book on the critical importance of the civil liberty that we know as freedom of speech, whose protection is enshrined in the First Amendment, will be published next week by Oxford University Press. So it's a real pleasure and to welcome Michael Glennon as a presenter this evening. And thank you, Michael, for taking the time to come and share your insights with us.
Jacob, thank you so much for those repeatedly kind words about my book. The other book, by the way, will be published next year, not next week. I wish it were next week, but there's a little more work to be done on it. And thank you also for inviting me to be here and participate in this star-studded cast of scholars and experts on this important subject of civil liberties. It's really a pleasure to be back with you again. My talk today is entitled Civil Liberties and Structural Safeguards. I picked that snooze of a title intentionally. I wanted to underscore why the point of this talk has been lost on generations of law students. I tell you this as someone who has taught constitutional law at American law schools for several decades. As many of you know, con law is typically taught in 2 semesters. The first semester deals with structural allocations of powers, separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, judicial review, and the like. Many law students view this first semester with a sense of migo. My eyes glaze over. The Commerce Clause, the 10th Amendment, the appointments power. To them, this is one arid desert. They're eager to move on to the lush fields of the second semester, to limits on government power, to civil liberties and political rights, equal protection, Bill of Rights, First Amendment, etc. Try as some of us law professors might, we never seem to be able to get across the central message. We're talking both semesters about the same issue. I know many of you are familiar with Justice Brandeis' pithy summary of the object of the separation of powers doctrine, but it's worth recalling. This is what he said, quote, "The doctrine of separation of powers was adopted by the Convention of 1787, not to promote efficiency, but to preclude the exercise of arbitrary power. The purpose was not to avoid friction, but by means of the inevitable friction incident to the distribution of governmental powers among the three departments, to save the people from autocracy," unquote. Saving the people from autocracy, of course, is also the purpose of the Bill of Rights. Prohibitions against abridgments of free speech, denials of due process, unreasonable searches and seizures, cruel and unusual punishment, and the like, are also directed at precluding the exercise of arbitrary power. So I'm going to talk today about how the weakening of one specific structural safeguard, civilian control of the security mechanism, which is central to the separation of powers doctrine, has imperiled one particular civil liberty, freedom of speech. That threat is posed by a security bureaucracy that has come to seek and to a degree has come to exercise independent, autonomous power. A recent book by Bob Woodward and Robert Costa raises a chilling specter for those of us who believe in civilian control of the military. It alleges that General Mark Milley ordered his subordinates to follow his orders rather than those of the president. Whether Milley actually did so is in one sense not the issue, although he has, to my knowledge, not denied that. The more important question, which I want to talk about this evening, is how we got to the point where many Americans appear to agree with the Senate Majority Whip, Senator Dick Durbin, who said, responding to those allegations, quote, "It is a shame we reached that point in American history. That's necessary. And I think he did the responsible thing to keep America out of war," unquote. How did we reach the point in American history at which it is seen as appropriate for a general with no command authority to insert himself into the constitutional chain of command above the President of the United States? Now, you may be thinking, I thought this was going to be a talk about civil liberties. Here you are discussing civilian control of the military. Well, again, that is precisely my point. Structural safeguards, such as civilian control of the military, and civil liberties, such as freedom of speech, are interdependent. Neither can survive without the other. Both rest on the same fundamental premises. I want to pause for a moment at the outset of my remarks here and highlight those shared premises. The first and most important common premise can be summed up in one word: pluralism. Inevitable friction, as Brandeis put it, is assumed to be part of the struggle for power among the three branches of the federal government and between the federal government and the states. And it was also similarly expected from the outset that conflict would be inescapable within the body politic, within what Justice Holmes would later christen the marketplace of ideas, though Holmes himself never actually used that specific term. The only way to eliminate that conflict would be to eliminate the oxygen of liberty that fueled it, as James Madison recognized. The second premise is that fractiousness in both government and the body politic is a good thing. It's not only inevitable, but desirable as a means of avoiding mistakes. The framers hadn't come up with 50-cent expressions like cognitive dissonance, pre-deliberation bias, and so forth, but they were intimately familiar with what we now refer to as groupthink. They knew that iconoclasts, naysayers, dissenters, boat rockers were necessary to keep government on its toes and also to keep the nation's political and intellectual life open and vibrant. The third premise underpinning both freedom of speech and separation of powers is that people are capable of identifying and acting upon their own best interests. If you don't believe in the ability of the individual to distinguish fact from fiction, there is no point in having a democratic assembly, which would have no reason to reflect what people want, because someone other than the people would always know better than the people what's best for the people to hear and to say. If that's true, why have a Congress? The fourth related premise is that for that very reason, pluralism, in fact, does promote efficiency. Brandeis downplayed this aspect of separation of powers, but the system of separated powers in the United States involves, obviously, Congress. There'd be no point in having a representative assembly like Congress without the ability to influence its decisions as to what laws it should make. This requires that citizens be free to exchange views and information, to speak and write and associate freely without fear of retribution. Congress can then accurately reflect people's wants and needs, which makes government a more efficient agent of the people. The fifth and final premise on which both free speech and separation of powers rest is tolerance. We accept not only speech that we hate, but also majoritarian action that we detest, because we ourselves are accorded the same right to speak and hear, and if we so desire, to form a different new majority. Reciprocity is the golden rule of political life. We tolerate to be tolerated. But we also tolerate out of humility. The spirit of liberty, Judge Learned Hand said, is the spirit that is not too sure that it is right, unquote. We tolerate opposing views because they may turn out to be right. I know these shared premises are not entirely consistent. As we all know, markets sometimes fail. Concentrations of power emerge. Therefore, the question arises, when the marketplace of ideas gets distorted, should government intervene to keep it operating efficiently with, say, campaign finance limits or subsidies or a fairness doctrine or right to reply requirements? Furthermore, the whole case for pluralism, whether in government or in the public marketplace of ideas, is wrapped in a paradox. Isn't it self-refuting to privilege pluralism? The whole point of which would seem to be that no competing values ought to be privileged, even pluralism itself. If we really believe in tolerance, for that matter, why tolerate intolerance? Shouldn't the marketplace of ideas be closed to the one idea that, if adopted, would be irreversible, the idea that the marketplace of ideas should be closed? Justice Holmes believed that the answer to that question is no. He wrote, quote, "If in the long run, the beliefs expressed in proletarian dictatorship are destined to be accepted by the dominant forces of the community, the only meaning of free speech is that they should be given their chance and have their way," unquote. Some, of course, disagree. Germany's constitution seems to place it on the other side of that issue. I myself basically agree with Holmes, but there are reasonable arguments on the other side in different countries with different histories and different cultures than our own. I'm not going to address these quandaries today. They're far beyond the scope of this talk. I will simply say that the deeper issue for me is not what categories of speech should be regulated, but that given the fuzziness of all those categories, whether we can trust government to regulate speech in a viewpoint neutral way that respects pluralism without overstepping its bounds. I will suggest to you in a moment that government's record in this regard is not reassuring. So my simple point here today is broader. Structural safeguards are civil liberties. They both rest on the same premises. They both look to multiple decentralized sources of power to keep open the supply line of conflicting information and clashing opinions. Neither structural safeguards nor civil liberties can exist without the other. So the message for first semester con law students is that both are aimed at securing the same end, safeguarding self-government through pluralism to save the people from autocracy. This was the enduring insight of one of America's greatest First Amendment scholars, Alexander Meiklejohn, whom President Kennedy selected for the Medal of Freedom. Meiklejohn wrote at length about the linkage that I've just discussed. He wrote that in a self-governing society, quote, "the governors and the governed are not two distinct groups of persons. There is only one group, the self-governing people. Ruled and rulers are the same individuals," unquote. And he added this crucial point that unless we remember that, quote, "discussion of freedom of speech or of any other freedom is meaningless and futile," unquote. So the threshold question this evening for civil libertarians is this: how healthy is self-government in the United States today? Are the rulers and the ruled in this country the same individuals? Structures change gradually, so it's easy to miss frog in the boiling water, structural entropy. But listen to the words of a highly respected former Republican member of Congress, Mickey Edwards. Edwards, from Oklahoma, served in the House for 16 years, and afterwards he taught government for 13 more years at Harvard and then Princeton. Edwards wrote this recently in Politico, quote, "We no longer have three branches of government. I taught my students a system of government based on the Constitution. I thought I was teaching about current events, Instead, I now realize I was teaching ancient history, unquote. Why would Edwards say that? Well, to many of us, Congress is not simply a collection of people. Congress is the set of powers that those people actually exercise. If you agree with this view, ask yourself, do we really have a Congress that exercises the power over the purse when Congress waits for presidents to submit their proposed budgets before beginning any serious spending discussions on its own, and then holds a single up or down vote on $1 trillion bill that's laid out in thousands of pages that not one of them has read? Do we really have a Congress that exercises the power to declare war when we have 240,000 troops serving in at least 172 countries and territories who have been killing or bombing in at least 10 of those countries, which most members of Congress could not even name? At some point, form is belied by substance. Edward Gibbon described the late Roman government as an absolute monarchy disguised by the forms of a commonwealth, unquote. Romans were deluded because the form of the Roman Senate remained the same long after its substantive powers had disappeared. So how great is the disparity in our own Senate between form and substance? Play a little thought experiment. How might Afghanistan have turned out had the Senate operated as our ancient Constitution contemplated? Well, maybe the president would have concluded the peace agreement with the Taliban, the Doha Accords, as a treaty approved by the Senate, as the Constitution requires, not as a back of the envelope executive agreement. Maybe the peace treaty should have been negotiated at a multi-party peace conference with all the belligerents present, including not only the Taliban, but the Afghan government and our NATO allies that fought so loyally beside us. Maybe all of them together meeting in public would have realized that there's a potential calamity on the horizon, and maybe they would have taken steps to avert it. Maybe the Senate, in debating that treaty, would have identified risks and oversights and scenarios that the executive had missed. Maybe the American people, aware of those risks, would not have been taken by surprise when a worst case scenario turned into reality. Maybe, in short, a little pluralism would have gone a long way. As this example suggests, pluralism is especially important in the realm of national security. A few years ago, I tried to evaluate the health of pluralistic American self-government in the realm of national security in a little book. The book was entitled National Security and Double Government, as Jacob mentioned. I suggested in that book that the governors of our national security mechanism, as Robert McNamara quaintly referred to it, were in effect a different group of people than the governed when it comes to the making of security policy. The public came to believe that the visible public Madisonian institutions, Congress, the presidency, the courts, defined national security policy. In fact, however, that policy was made largely behind the scenes. It was made by a concealed network of several hundred managers within the diplomatic, military, intelligence, and law enforcement agencies of the government, who had largely escaped democratic accountability. The illusion of democratic accountability persisted, I suggested, because the security managers and the Madisonian institutions mostly managed to avoid public disagreement. They took care always to appear to be on the same page, to project a reassuring image of harmony. This appearance preserved everyone's credibility. It provided policy continuity and short-term stability, just enough for, not on my watch, Madisonian officials to avoid embarrassment. But let there be no doubt where the power lay. Dean Acheson, the archdeacon of the security priesthood, spoke for many of his colleagues when he articulated the central truth behind America's double government. Acheson said, quote, "If you truly had a democracy and did what the people wanted, you'd go wrong every time," unquote. The whole hidden structure of double government was based on that premise, on a fear of pluralism, on distrust of the people, on the wisdom of experts. I raise this book now because in it, I departed from description and I speculated erroneously that no president would ever seek to recover control of national security policy by launching a public frontal assault on the security managers network for two reasons. The first I thought was practical, the second was theoretical. In the 5 years since that book was published, I've come to believe that understanding my miscalculation is crucial to understanding the watershed moment that the United States is facing today. The practical reason was simply that I believed the managers of the national security mechanism are too powerful to take on, even for a president, I thought. My logic was based on personal experience like this one. When I was the legal counsel of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the head of the CIA, Richard Helms, was convicted of testifying falsely before our committee. Helms's lawyer announced that his client would wear that conviction like a badge of honor. I drafted an op-ed suggesting that, subverting democracy's truth-finding processes is not really something to be proud of. And I tried to get some member of the committee, any member of the committee, to sign it. No one would sign. Finally, a senior member of the committee that I was close to took me aside and he said to me, "Glennon, don't you understand how powerful those people are? No one on this committee is going to sign that op-ed." Well, a freshman member of the committee finally did sign, and it was published in the New York Times. He lost the next election. I was reminded of that experience not long ago when Senate Majority Leader Charles Schumer blurted out a warning to President Donald Trump. Schumer said Trump was being really dumb, taking on the intelligence community. Quote, "Let me tell you, you take on the intelligence community, they have 6 ways from Sunday at getting back at you," unquote. For years, of course, this was not supposed to be said out loud, but it's now out in the open, in part because many of the security managers' newfound friends like to brag about their alliance. More about that in just a minute. The second reason that I believed at the time that no president would publicly take on the security mechanism was that any open break between the White House and the security managers would undermine the legitimacy of both the president and the security managers. Why? Well, consider the sources of their power. Why does each have credibility with the public? Start with the president. When a president claims the need to act immediately in response to a national security emergency, say to blockade Cuba in response to a Soviet missile buildup, people respect the president's decision because of his electoral connection. The president was chosen through a pre-agreed, constitutionally prescribed procedure that relied upon the vote of the American people. But the president's judgment is also accepted because he relies upon and is known to rely upon bona fide experts in assessing that threat. If the president publicly demeans the only available experts or replaces them with sycophants or bases his decision on, say, his own gut feelings or ideology, why should people believe that he's making the right decision? So he can't afford to badmouth his experts. So I thought. Now consider the security manager's legitimacy. Their power also depends upon their legitimacy, but their legitimacy flows from a different source than the president's. They're respected because they're experts, true, but unlike the president, these experts have no direct electoral connection. No one voted for Richard Helms or Avril Haines or Bill Burns. Their institutional legitimacy is derivative. It's tied to and justified by the president's legitimacy. When that tie is broken, the whole system is destabilized. This was, I should add, not only my own belief, it was also the belief of the leading theorist of British constitutionalism and the originator of the idea of double government, Walter Bagehot. Bagehot believed that it was essential that the concealed institutions that actually run the government always maintain a public image of harmony with the front pieces that appear to run it. If an open rift should occur, the whole system would fall to earth. His words. So, for these reasons, I thought we would never witness a public break between a president and a security mechanism. But that is, of course, exactly what occurred during the administration of Donald Trump. Now, set aside who started it or who was at fault, Russia's role, the FISA warrants, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to get into all that today. The point is that Trump repeatedly and publicly went after what he referred to as the deep state, and for their part, the security managers and their alumni went after Trump full bore with a barrage of leaks, op-eds, public letters, cable news attacks, you name it. The so-called deep state, as a result, was no longer deep. It was entirely out in the open, and that open break marked a new phase in double government. In this new phase, the breach with the Madisonian institutions and the collapse of the facade of unity has created a problem for the security managers. They were cut off from the source of their institutional legitimacy, the president's electoral connection. They were therefore required to incubate their own freestanding legitimacy. But this could only be a tactic, not a strategy aimed at broad-based approval, because there was a slight constitutional problem in what they were doing. The Constitution, after all, has it that the security forces can exercise only delegated power, power that is conferred upon them by an elected president or the people's elected representatives in Congress. Nowhere does the Constitution establish a security bureaucracy as a fourth branch of government, let alone as the supreme authority over the self-governing Madisonian institutions. Inverting legislative and bureaucratic authority would be a complete departure from a Michelsonian system in which the governed and the governors are the same people. Moreover, since Trump was not going to be around forever, presumably, a long-term solution to establishing standalone legitimacy required a more sustainable strategy. So the question for the security managers was quite simply, how do we go about this? The means they chose would have to depend first on what obstacles they would need to overcome, and second, on what tools were available to overcome those obstacles. One obstacle, in theory, was the First Amendment. The First Amendment has historically been a prominent, visible barrier to the government's efforts to squelch public debate on topics it doesn't want discussed. Think, for example, the Pentagon Papers case. The government, as you know, made a very public, overt effort to keep the public from knowing that it had been repeatedly lied to about the government's prosecution of the war in Vietnam. Cases such as this have fostered a widespread impression that freedom of expression is alive and well in the United States. When government tries to squelch free speech, the courts say, no, you can't do that. There's still lots of examples where this old three-stage public dynamic plays out. Public expression, followed by public suppression, followed by public vindication. But the thing is, this technique of public speech control is old hat. Overtly suppressing speech is an antiquated 20th century technique of controlling unwanted expression. As a method of keeping dangerous information and ideas out of the marketplace, it doesn't work. Government propagandists have known for some time that overt suppression is self-defeating. It discredits the authorities behind the suppression, who are seen for what they are, censors. It turns the speaker into a martyr or a hero. And it makes the publicly suppressed information more attractive, not less attractive. The solution to the problem of overt speech control is therefore obvious and simple. You do it covertly. You keep the suppression secret. As Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan put it, secrecy is the ultimate form of regulation because people don't even know they're being regulated, unquote. Turns out you don't even have to be completely secret about squelching free speech. It's good enough not to be blindingly obvious about it. And the First Amendment leaves space for government to do exactly that. First Amendment poses no limits on government propaganda or government indoctrination efforts. Government speech, so-called government speech, has long been held by the courts to be immune from First Amendment constraints. Nothing in the First Amendment stops the government from drowning out the speech of dissidents with its own speech, or toxifying those dissidents with its own speech, or chilling speech that the government labels extremist misinformation, all with the happy result that the public becomes, to borrow a phrase from Pink Floyd, comfortably benumbed. You may believe, as I do, that government should not shape culture. Culture should shape government. But as the courts have construed the First Amendment, nothing in it precludes the government or groups within the government, like the security managers, from wading waist deep into the culture wars and trying to curry favor with potential political allies by waving BLM flags or pride flags, or decrying white rage, or trying to stigmatize whomever they define as extremists. The guardrails that have historically kept government from aligning itself with one subculture against another subculture have been informal political norms, not formal constitutional rules. Furthermore, as we all know, the First Amendment poses no limits on private actors who do those things, or for that matter, on private actors like YouTube that just ban speech outright. This leaves an enormous space within which government can use those private actors to accomplish what government itself would be forbidden from doing under the First Amendment. Better yet, from their perspective, private actors in social media can bury information on their websites or simply apply friction, so-called, so that people don't know they're being censored. Yes, of course, there are formal limits. The state action doctrine, so-called, is aimed at keeping government on the constitutional reservation by applying constitutional limits to private actors that act in the government's stead. I'm not going to get into the technical details today, but suffice it to say, the case law on the state action doctrine is an incoherent mess. And as a private matter, a practical matter, the security managers confront virtually no chance that the courts will stop them if they enlist private actors to manipulate speech or suppress speech for them. So the First Amendment turns out to be no great impediment on the security mechanisms path to standalone legitimacy. But there are two other obstacles: history and competence. Let's turn to those. The security mechanism's history suggests that it might not be the most appealing partner in a new domestic political coalition. And its record for competence is not exactly stellar. I think you'll see, in considering both, how the space left by the First Amendment gives the security managers plenty of room to keep a tight lid on the marketplace of ideas. Take history first. I doubt that it would be news to anyone that the security mechanism's leaders have not fallen over themselves to promote the robust, vibrant, and open debate that the Supreme Court has described is essential for the proper functioning of American democracy. One of the best books on this subject is Perilous Times by Professor Jeffrey Stone. Stone details the security bureaucracy's historic hostility toward free speech, going back to the earliest days of the Republic. But you don't have to go back that far. Take just a moment and recall recent history. events that many of us have lived through and experienced ourselves. The most comprehensive account of those events appeared 45 years ago in the report of the Church Committee. Most of you are probably familiar with its findings, which I won't take the time to review here this evening. But the thing to remember is that the activities unveiled in that report were not rare one-off pranks undertaken by some lone cowboy. These were painstakingly planned, deliberate programs in which America's most trusted security services, under the direction of their leaders and acting over a period of many years, turned their dark arts against the very people they were created to protect, as Professor Locke Johnson put it. Their actions were a violation of the public trust. They tried to alter the people's form of government without the people's knowledge or consent. Their aim, in Meiklejohn's terms, was to separate the governed from the governors. My former boss at the Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Frank Church, warned on Meet the Press that NSA surveillance could lead us over an abyss from which there is no return. It's a sign of NSA's utter shamelessness that at the very moment Church spoke those words, NSA was secretly listening in on Church's own international phone calls. So that is part of the history that the security managers needed to overcome in courting domestic allies. How do you do that? Well, as any political consultant will tell you, when you confront a problem so large you can't run away from it, you embrace it. And that's exactly what the security managers have done. We may be nasty, their message has been, but nasty is just what you need. And that message has worked beautifully. At least it worked against Trump. It wasn't simply Senator Schumer who extolled the security managers 6 ways from Sunday at getting back at them. The security managers themselves took pride in this. Listen to the words of Philip Mudd, former top official at both the CIA and the FBI during the Trump administration. Quote, "So the FBI people, I'm going to tell you, are ticked. And they're going to be saying, I guarantee it, you think you could push us off this because you can try to intimidate the director? You'd better think again, Mr. President. You've been around for 13 months. We've been around since 1908. I know how this game is going to be played, and we're going to win." Unquote. Well, appeals like this worked. One prominent neocon, Bill Kristol, said that he'd prefer the deep state to the Trump state. The New Yorker magazine predicted that the intelligence community's managers would challenge Trump before Congress, and it allowed. This was as it should be. The magazine said, quote, "This is just the sort of thing we want to see happening as part of the fabled checks and balances in the US system," unquote. Eugene Washington, the Washington Post columnist, wrote, quote, "God bless the deep state." He said the deep state should be celebrated. The deep state stands between us and the abyss. If the president does not serve the best interest of the nation, the loyal and honorable deep state, his words, the loyal and honorable deep state has the higher duty to step in and stop him. Of course, the security managers do all they can to encourage this sort of adulation and to underscore that we are the guys with the guns, as General Milley reminded anyone who might have forgotten. Until very recently, some of the security managers risked actual prosecution in other countries for torture and free fire zones and classic textbook aggression. Now they are embraced as enlightened guardians of safe zones, tortured themselves by incorrect pronouns, on the watch for microaggressions. You've really got to hand it to them. There are very few social justice warriors on campus these days who can match that skill in virtue signaling and moral grandstanding and pull it all off with a straight face. It's really quite amazing. So the security bureaucracy is managing to overcome historical obstacles that stand in the way of generating a domestic following. But there's a second obstacle, as I noted, competence. You don't need to go back to their failure to prevent the 9/11 attacks or their slam dunk assurances that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which of course laid the groundwork for that disastrous war. No, start with today's headlines. Of course, the Afghanistan evacuation comes immediately to mind, but we'll get to that in just a minute. No, start with COVID. COVID, question. COVID has been framed as a public health crisis. Why was COVID not a security failure? When COVID appeared on the horizon, the security managers, not just the public health scientists, but the security managers should have been standing on the rooftops shouting at the tops of their lungs, emergency, take cover, get prepared. This was not simply an intelligence failure, it was a monumental defense failure, a failure in protecting the homeland, a failure in safeguarding the lives of the American people. Every military planner knew that it can be all but impossible to distinguish a naturally occurring pandemic from a hostile bioweapons attack. At the beginning of an outbreak, and very often long into an outbreak, you simply cannot tell whether the pathogen that caused it came from nature or was introduced intentionally by a hostile power. The devastating consequences of the two are exactly the same. This was what the nation had been told it needed to prepare for over and over and over since the 9/11 attacks. We knew after 9/11, after the anthrax attacks, that we needed a truly national early warning system. We needed hospital capacity. We needed PPE, respirators, trained doctors and staff, contact tracing, a testing regime, all the rest. They should have warned us, and they should have been ready, but they were not. And they've dodged any accountability for this security calamity that has now killed 700,000 Americans. How have they managed to do that? Well, as I noted at the outset, through a clever reframing of the issue. It wasn't a security issue, it was a public health issue. The doctors, the scientists blew it, not the intelligence communities, HUMINT and China, not NSA's National Technical Means that might have picked up the PRC's early efforts to stifle their own early concerns about the virus, not the thousands of people doing research for DOD on bioterror pathogens. Reframing works. It's a method of denial, distraction, and deflection. Reframing is one of the basic techniques of modern information warfare, a way to put a lid on an overly frothy marketplace of ideas, a way to avoid blame. Which brings us to Afghanistan. First, why Afghanistan? Let me emphasize this once again. Civil liberties rest on a foundation of self-government. self-government in the American constitutional system presupposes a functional separation of power system. In a functional separation of power system, power is delegated to the security bureaucracy, not by it. If the security bureaucracy embarks on a project to achieve independent legitimacy, that is worth knowing, because as the night follows the day, an autonomous security mechanism will endanger civil liberties and political freedom. So it's hard to exaggerate the gravity of what we're talking about. Open breaks between civilian leadership and security leadership historically have been the death knell of democracies. I would add that it is particularly worth knowing whether the security mechanism is continuing to seek institutional autonomy in this political context, because for the last year, the security managers have had a very strong incentive not to engage in zero-sum legitimacy building. Let's cut to the quick. Joe Biden was their guy. Once it became a choice between Biden and their archenemy, Donald Trump, this was a no-brainer. The security mechanism did all it could to get Biden elected. Looming in the background of the Afghanistan debacle has been the specter of Trump rising from the ashes. The security managers therefore confronted a dilemma. On the one hand, to deflect the blame to a hapless, bumbling Joe Biden would enhance their own political bona fides by distancing themselves from political incompetence. But on the other hand, to do that could ultimately strengthen Donald Trump in 2024. So if they continued to try to enhance their own standalone legitimacy under these adverse circumstances, that would say a great deal about their strength of their commitment to do that. Now, let me anticipate an objection before we examine this. The objection is, it was Biden's own fault. He and his political advisors planned the operation, the evacuation, poorly, and executed those plans abominably, and through it all, they all but ignored the expert security managers. Let's be honest, that may be true. But it may also be true that the security managers assumed that they would ultimately prevail, as they always had in the past, and that they therefore did not plan for worst case scenarios until it was too late. Doug Luty, the general who directed Afghan policy at the National Security Council for Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama, was very candid about this. The Pentagon believed its own narrative that we would stay forever, quote unquote, Luty told the New York Times. Therefore, Luty said, no contingency plan was put in place to make a disorderly exit work. Maybe a worst case scenario was never thoroughly gamed out, as Luty suggested. Maybe the security managers, in effect, dared Biden and his advisors to go ahead with the withdrawal and face the consequences, as they have. Maybe someday we'll know the answer to what extent that was true. Last week's hearings before the House and Senate certainly didn't resolve that question. My guess is that if history is any guide, the public will learn simply that, as usual, mistakes were made without ever learning who made the mistakes. That's how no-fault decision-making works in unaccountable bureaucracies. In the meantime, however, we can, as I say, know something very important. Whether throughout it all, the security mechanism remained committed to its earlier project of establishing institutional autonomy. And to know that, we don't have to know who decided what behind closed doors. We can know from the public record who said what about who made the mistakes, and how the other side responded. The answer, in other words, lies in each side's public messaging. Was the political leadership or the security mechanism trying to make nice with the other side, to paper over differences? Or was it sticking it to the other side, striking out on its own, with an implicit challenge to the other side to adapt and stay on its message, a message that redounded to its political benefit? If you analyze the messaging through that prism, as I have, there's still lots of background noise, but if you look closely at it, you do get a pretty clear answer. And the answer is that the security managers struck out largely on their own and defended themselves from the onslaught of public outrage, and the political leadership tried to keep up with the security managers' messaging. Even though double government had changed, the security managers' muscle memory led it to assume that it could and would and should continue to dominate the decision-making process, and that any questioning of its decisions by the nation's political leadership would be visibly and publicly corrected. To put it bluntly, the security managers were not about to see their newly acquired autonomy destroyed by a crowd of bunglers in the White House. Worse yet, by bunglers who, they may well have believed, would not have been in the White House without their help. Look first at the messaging from the security managers. If you look closely at what they said, you get a fairly distinct picture of the point they want to impart. And that point is this: the security mechanism was not to blame. The gang that couldn't shoot straight was in the White House, not the Pentagon, not in Langley. The security bosses continued to criticize the decision to leave and did all they could to distance themselves from its calamitous execution. Their own political legitimacy now came first. The justification for doing that was explicitly articulated by the CIA's former counterterrorism chief for South and Southwest Asia. He said, quote, "Operating in the shadows and supporting the White House will prevent the intelligence community from publicly defending itself. There was no intelligence failure by the agency and warning by the Trump or Biden as to how events would play out," unquote. Numerous other current and former security officials chimed in with essentially the same message. The errors were made by the political leaders, not by the security managers. That was their message at last week's congressional hearings. Again, don't take my word for it. Go to the public record. It's all there. Now, contrast the security managers' efforts to shift the blame with the civilian leadership's efforts to calm the waters and project nothing but harmony with the security mechanism. Was there a need, as the CIA official had put it, for the intelligence community to publicly defend itself? Answer, no. No. Not based on anything that came out of the White House. The political leadership made virtually no effort to pin the evacuation debacle on the security mechanism. It was as though nothing had changed since the days of double government. The White House communication staff continued to assume that the American people would once again be persuaded that the security mechanism was under the control of the Madisonian institutions. Again, there are many examples. Suffice it to say that Biden's own instinct was the instinct of his administration to claim that he and his team knew all along what the risk was and found no fault with the security managers. There was no way to have gotten out of this without chaos ensuing, Biden claimed. That was priced into the decision, he told George Stephanopoulos. No mistakes were made. It was an extraordinary success. Biden planned for all contingencies, his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, repeatedly claimed. Biden's defenders in the corporate media mimicked the administration's happy talk. This is what a war that we did not win looks like, the Post's Eugene Robinson said. What's the problem? Again, I don't suggest there are no counterexamples, but the weight of the evidence is that the security apparatus, even at the cost of compromising a key political ally, Joe Biden, pressed ahead to establish its own standalone legitimacy as the guardians of the guardian. And the weight of the evidence is that the political leadership barely lifted a finger to defend itself. God was on his throne. All's right with the government. It was operating as the Constitution had ordained. Nobody got jammed. But if they really believed that, the political leadership was living in a dream world, in a time warp. This was not 1961. This was not the Bay of Pigs, after which CIA officials who had disagreed with Kennedy's refusal to aid the invaders kept their mouths shut. This was a country in which the security mechanism was now a force to be reckoned with publicly, a force that expected deference, a force that would take no guff from a president or his staff. This was a country in which a military leader who disagrees with the civilian leadership, rather than resigning in protest and allowing democratic processes to work its will, can usurp that process and be met with applause. This was a country in which separation of powers had become, as Mickey Edwards said, history. And with it, inevitably, the regime of self-government that safeguards civil liberties and political freedom. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Professor Glennon, for that absolutely excellent and insightful talk. It's just a fantastic contribution to our conference series here on civil liberties. So before I begin the questions that are being submitted to you, let me just read one comment that you might find interesting. Hi, Michael, your cousin-in-law, Alex here. Great talk.
Well, thank you, Alex.
Okay, on to the questions then. Let me shut down that. How much damage do you think the deep state did to Trump's 2020 reelection efforts? This is not to imply that Trump deserved to win or that he was robbed of the election. Simply asking how much influence you think the deep state had in the 2020 election.
That's one of those questions that, as I said, I don't really want to get into in any detail tonight because that goes back a long ways. Just to say, in sum, I think that alumni and former members of the intelligence community and national security establishment played a significant role in the public media in coming out against Trump. I don't know that it would have made a difference one way or the other. 42,000 people had voted differently in 3 states. You might have a different president today, but that's one of those things that I really don't want to get into. I do think, though, that it's important to focus on the central issue, which is the fact of the break, Trump's willingness to take on the security managers and the security managers' willingness to fight back, which has destabilized the system of double government that we lived with for many decades. And who's at fault, who won, who lost, I think, is in a sense secondary to this central insight that the whole system is now on a very different institutional footing.
Okay, next question. Could you comment further on COVID, perhaps regarding the role of the media in failing to competently analyze the risks and paying scant attention to federal failures?
Well, I think the most prominent failure of the media and federal government together has been an unwillingness of the media to recognize fully that the federal government has been inconsistent in its messaging, going back, as we all know, to the earlier advice concerning the utility of masks and many about faces that have occurred in the public messaging of the CDC and World Health Organization since the beginning. It's very difficult in some circumstances to find out who said what when, because these little tidbits of news tend to disappear into the memory hole. You have to do a little digging to discover that someone's advice today is very different from what it was several months ago. That's been the principal failure. And I think the public's distrust in the news media has, in many respects, derived from the media's sense of responsibility for propping up the government's messaging on COVID. I don't think that's the proper role of the news media. I think that its role is to maintain a open and vibrant marketplace of ideas, as I said in my talk. And once the news media becomes identified as an arm of the government, an arm of the state, it ceases to be taken seriously as an impartial platform in which both sides of a question can be presented. And I think this is one of the factors that contributes to the vaccine hesitancy that we're seeing today. People don't know who to trust.
Okay, this question relates to the previous question. So if you feel like you've already addressed it or you don't want to delve further into it, just feel free to tell me. Do you take any comfort from the fact that the security apparatus, despite its power, was not able to take down Trump through impeachment anyway, or from the fact that the Durham investigation seems to be pulling together the possibility of some accountability? Does this suggest needed structures are still in place, or is this just wishful thinking?
I don't see this as very encouraging. It's possible that the Durham investigation will surprise all of us. It seems to me that talking about needed structures being in place, the needed structures under our system are constitutional structures, oversight structures, and those have just proven to be abysmally inadequate. Look at the very serious questions that have arisen just over the last couple of weeks in connection with General Milley's conduct as described in Bob Woodward's book, Peril. he has described, as I said, apparently from Milley's own account, he said Milley talked to him. Milley acknowledged that. Woodward didn't say Milley talked to him. Milley acknowledged that he talked to him, that Milley spoke with military officials who were directed by Milley to be sure to speak to him before proceeding to follow an order from the President of the United States, inserting himself in the chain of command, arguably above the president. Now, that's the allegation. I've read that passage in the book. It seems to me not entirely clear whether this was a pre-established procedure or whether Milley went beyond that procedure. But this is something that Congress needs to look into very carefully, it seems to me. What did Milley actually say? What were the pre-established procedures? And the questioning that was undertaken in the Senate Armed Services Committee last week, it seems to me, was pretty inadequate. Nobody seemed terribly interested in getting to the bottom of these things. One senator asked Milley whether he actually said what was described in the book, and Milley's response was, well, let me tell you what I did say. Well, that wasn't the question. And of course, you know, Jacob, as a trial lawyer, if you're taking a deposition, the next question is, thank you very much, but the question that I asked you was whether you said X, not Y. Let's return to X. Did you say that? Well, no one asked Milley that. And, you know, if you had a oversight committee that was really interested in getting to the bottom of this, I think he would have been pressed pretty hard on that, possibly not even by the senators, but by counsel, as occurred during the Watergate hearings under Senator Sam Ervin. But Congress has faded a lot since the Watergate days, and I'm very pessimistic about the opportunity that Congress has to recover its lost power.
All right. There's a question about ballot access laws. Does the censorship by ballot access laws, or for whom voters may vote for or elect, exemplify the connection of structure and civil liberties?
I'm just not prepared to talk about that. Sorry.
Okay, no, that's fine. Next one. In your opinion, which countries do the best job of performing the functions that you think government ought to perform? And to what extent is this due to their structure of the government?
Well, that's a great question. I have to tell you that I don't place great weight on governmental structure or constitutional structure. I think ultimately that well-governed countries are governed largely because of social norms rather than legal or constitutional requirements that establish an orderly society. I can't put it as eloquently as Judge Learned Hand, but he said, when the spirit of liberty dies in the hearts of the people, no constitution, no law, no court can save it. Many Americans are tempted, asking questions like the one that you just put to me, to look abroad and try to find governmental structures that can somehow lift us up by our bootstraps and give us a government better than the people ultimately responsible for making the government work. That's not how it happens in a democracy. I think Adlai Stevenson was right. He said, in a democracy, people get exactly the quality of government they deserve. The structure is not that important. You could probably take the Constitution or elements of the Constitution of France or Denmark or Britain, or parliamentary system, as a number of people have proposed over the years, and inject it into the United States. But that's not going to change things. You can't, with fancy institutional fencing, make up for an absence of social capital and private institutions that produce a well-governed society. You need, in short, strong followers to produce strong leaders. And while a better electoral system, there are ways it could be improved, might produce stronger leaders at some stage in the process, the question always arises: would the people today identify and appreciate a Thomas Jefferson or an Abraham Lincoln? That's an open question, but I'm not sure the answer is terribly pleasing.
Okay, the Fifth Amendment prohibits the taking of life without due process of law. Can you reconcile that with the power of the Pentagon and the CIA to assassinate people?
As I read your piece today on Soleimani and the contemplation of assassinating Julian Assange, first of all, let me just say, as an international lawyer, there's clearly a prohibition in international law against state-sponsored assassination and state-sponsored kidnapping. And this is far more important internationally and far more basic than the prohibition in the United Nations Charter against non-defensive use of force. Before the United Nations Charter was put in place in 1945, this prohibition had been in place for many, many decades before that, as a general principle of law recognized by civilized nations. Civilized nations don't engage in assassination for the simple reason that under basic principles of reciprocity that govern in international relations, you don't want your own streets to turn into a shooting gallery. If you engage in assassination abroad, you're inviting other states' leaders to act pursuant to that same precept. It's a kind of golden rule of international behavior. So our own law incorporates this principle of international law. It's a treaty obligation, and in my judgment, it's not only a treaty obligation, as I say, it's a principle of general international law, and it's binding on the president. But beyond that, as you say, there is the due process clause, which prohibits any deprivation of life without due process of law. It gets complicated to ask it as a general question because there are exceptions, of course, for fugitives seeking to escape from law enforcement authorities after there's probable cause to believe that they committed a crime, and there is arguably, hypothetically, in some circumstances, no alternative but to kill those individuals. So it's hard to come up with a simple blanket statement that because the individual in question was killed without judicial process, the Constitution was violated. I think the short answer, therefore, Jacob, is that these situations are heavily fact dependent, and you'd need to know much more about the context before trying to answer that question.
Okay, let's have one last question, and I'll do it by combining two questions. One is, what is to be done to fix this situation? And the other is, so what is the best method of eliminating the security managers not authorized by the Constitution? So the question, I guess, is what do you see as a solution to all this?
I'm very pessimistic. I didn't present any solution in the book National Security and Double Government. Going back to my earlier answer, I don't believe that it's sensible to look to governmental institutions to solve the problem by exercising power that they don't have. The central difficulty is that they lack the power to address these difficulties for some of the reasons that we've discussed. And they can't therefore look to their own power to make up the deficit. The energy has to come, as many people have observed, from outside the system. Outside the system means the people. You need, in short, something like, I don't mean this substantively, but something with the energy of a Tea Party or a populist movement that takes a keen interest in electing to office individuals who are intent on addressing this problem, as was done during the 1970s, early 1970s, following Watergate. There were dozens of reformers elected to Congress by an outraged citizenry. And you raised the question, Jacob, in your piece this morning on the Assange stories. Where's the outrage? Where's the outrage? People just look at a story like that and they think, well, that's interesting. They thought about killing Julian Assange. I wonder if that's legal, but who knows? Where's the outrage? Unless people can get beyond that question and feel the outrage, it seems to me, this is not a problem that's going to get solved. It's going to continue to get worse and worse. So there is no fix in the sense that this is not going to be resolved by, enacting a new 5-part program or adding a new subsection to any relevant oversight legislation concerning, say, the War Powers Resolution or intelligence oversight. This is not the, or coming up for that matter with an executive order. The problem is ultimately one that goes back to the people and the weakness of the institutions that exist outside of government. The energy has to come from outside the government, and unless the people do rise up and say enough, which doesn't seem to be, to me, to be likely, because these kinds of problems don't have a real constituency. That's the central difficulty. The people who care about these issues tend to be spread out. And as a result, you find very few members of Congress who feel that their feet is being held to the fire when it comes to addressing these sorts of problems. I mean, how many, say, members of the Senate Armed Services Committee were flooded with phone calls because they didn't pin General Milley to the wall, asking him whether Bob Woodward's allegations were true? It didn't happen, and it's not likely to happen. Those people are too spread out. So I just don't see this problem getting resolved. And in the meantime, even with an energized public, the solution is not to eliminate the so-called deep state or the security apparatus. No one is suggesting that. I mean, I suppose it's possible to infer that I was painting them as the bad guys in my talk. Well, let me be clear about that. There are real risks to our security in this world, and we need to defend ourselves. Now, whether we need a central intelligence agency to do that, or whether the covert action part of the agency, the Directorate of Operations, ought to be part of the CIA, whether it should be split off from the Directorate of Intelligence, the analytic people, that's a legitimate question. And there are a lot of questions that arise like that. Truman, as you know, proposed that that very significant reforms like that occur, and he made that proposal, I think, a month after President Kennedy's assassination, in the op-ed piece in the Washington Post, which was very hard to find for many years. You can now Google Truman, CIA, Washington Post and find that op-ed. He suggested in that piece that he was mistaken to allow the formation of an entity such as the CIA. And, you know, one wonders what he knew about the Kennedy assassination that caused him to think that, or what he feared about it. But my point again is simply this, that nobody can think that there is a simple solution to this problem, and certainly not the elimination of the deep state. It's much more complex than that.
Well, for 31 years, Michael, for what it's worth, we've been saying that the solution to all this mess in Washington does not lie in Washington. It lies with the American people, that this is an educational task. And until Americans decide that they want to restore the sound, good principles of this country, we're going to continue wallowing in all of this mess that we're in. That's where the solution lies, with the American people. So, and through programs like this, I mean, thank you very much. It's an excellent presentation. Thank you for taking so much time on the Q&A. I'm sure our viewers appreciate it. And thank you all for tuning in. Next week, we've got Richard Ebeling, who's been associated with FFF from the very beginning. Those of y'all that know Richard know that he's a fantastic speaker. He's going to be tying the relationship between civil liberties and economic liberties together. I think I know you'll absolutely enjoy Richard's presentation. Again, thanks for tuning in. Again, thank you, Michael, for an absolutely excellent presentation.
Thank you, Jake.